What's up, y'all? It's me, Andrew Prometheus. Today's topic could be considered to be somewhat controversial. Hopefully not. But I'm going to give my honest opinion about why I don't trust or believe the King James Bible, right? Today in my cup, I'm going to pour a little bit of coconut water. My favorite brand I've been able to find so far is the Kirkland one at Costco. They say it's organic, there's no added sugars. I like how long the sell use by date is. You can get a big old box of them, they last a while, right? If I read the ingredients list on it, which I always think is important to do, the ingredients are organic coconut water, and that's it. One ingredient. I like that a lot. Cheers. So, we'll get down to business. There are many reasons why I don't personally believe or trust this book, but I'll start from the beginning. Whenever you look at a book or a piece of music or a study that's done in science, you want to look at who's paying for it. Who paid for it, right? You've got to look at who paid for it. It's also a good idea to do this with just about everything you consume. Who paid for it? Then you want to look at why. So, for example, if you find out there's a very popular study that says that chicken is bad for you, and you find out it was paid for by one of the largest sellers of beef, you might have to question that because beef and chicken compete in the markets, right? That's just one quick example. I'll give you another one. If you read a book titled 10 Ways Your Vape Will Kill You, and it's paid for by tobacco companies, you might not want to believe it, right? Because these things compete against each other in the markets. So, if we go back to the King James Bible, if you study history, you'll find out that right around the time of King Henry VIII, that is when the Church of England was formed, and there was what's called a schism, and Christianity forked, and the Church of England left the Vatican, the Pope, right? Up until that time, the King of England was listening to the Pope and the Vatican. So, what's important to recognize is when this fork happened, a competition began for who the dominant Christian entity would be, right? Now, clearly, the Vatican has a lot of power because the calendar that we all use is called the Gregorian calendar, which means it was made by a man named Pope Gregory. Now, you may not agree with this, but if you want to know who you are ruled by, look at whose calendar you're forced to use. If you study the great conquerors, the first thing they would do when they conquered a new area was put them on some type of standard to keep unity and uniformity amongst the empire. Also, it made it a little easier to collect taxes, right? Because it's all about money at the end of the day. So, this book, the King James Bible, right? Number one most selling book of all time, right? It's important to know that. But who paid for it? Well, it was paid for by a British king named King James. Now, there's a lot of debate over this, but this was right around the time of Sir Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare. So, why would a British king pay someone to make a new version of the Bible or pay a group of people to create a new version of the Bible, right? The answer is very simple. There's a lot of power. There's a lot of power in getting to tell people what to believe. right? So, that's one reason. Now, I'm an American. Maybe this is important to factor in. But we are supposed to be sovereign from somewhere like England, right? There's this big popular story about when Americans fought the Revolutionary War and declared our independence and gained our independence from Britain. There's a little less discussion about how in 1812, Britain came and burned our capital to the ground, right? That's a whole nother discussion. But if we're supposed to be sovereign from Britain, why do we use their version of the Bible? This is one question, right? But the more important detail to me is a true word of an actual God wouldn't need multiple versions, right? Maybe a translation or two from one language to another. That's fair, even though every time something's translated, whoever's doing the translation has an awful lot of power to do a little editing if they want to. But what's important to look at is this is a newer version, right, of a text that's been handed down for a very long time and been added to for a very long time. So, some of the issues I have with this book are I don't personally believe lies. So, one lie in a holy text is too many for me. So, if you're going to tell me, for example, like in the story of Abraham, that his 90-year-old wife became pregnant, I don't believe you. Straight up, I don't believe that. 90-year-old women do not become pregnant, right? If you dig a little farther, the story of Passover, right? There's a big celebration about how a bunch of babies weren't murdered, and then it's kind of overlooked that a bunch of babies were murdered, right? So the celebration of a bunch of Egyptian babies being murdered seems a little off to me. Now, I don't believe a spirit goes around killing babies. So that means that this either didn't happen or it was a man who went around and killed these babies, or men who went around, or women who went around and killed these babies to scare everybody, right? During what could have been considered a mystical and superstitious time period. But if you dig into it, time after time, chapter after chapter, book after book, there's a lot of things that are not really true or believable. Like the story of the ark and Noah is impossible, right? All of these things that sound like a lot of fun, and we want to believe, if you're raised that way, I don't believe that, right? So beyond that, I also see a lot of very different versions kind of floating around, right? If you study Judaism, there are supposedly 633, 318, I forget the number exactly, but there's more than 10 commandments, right? In the books written by Moses, known as the Torah, which is the first chunk of the Old Testament, right? The Genesis through Deuteronomy is supposedly written by Moses, right? There's more than 10 commandments in these books. There's 300, there's hundreds. There's hundreds of them. So why in the King James Bible does it say that Moses went up and came down with 10 commandments? And why are there actual books and books and books and commandments and commandments? Like I believe the section of Leviticus has tons of orders and commandments. It's very complex. It's hard to keep track of. There's a lot of interpretations of these rules and commandments, right? This is where something like the necessity to eat kosher foods comes from. But if you dig farther into it, if the Old Testament was actually preserved, why isn't it exactly the same across the board, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So that's one thing, is why would the telephone game apply and why would it be different? But beyond that, why would something like the Book of Enoch, for example, have been removed from the Bible when the King James Version was written, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, why are those removed, right? Why do people get to pick and choose what is and isn't part of the Word of God, right? So it's all very obviously a paid-for production with some type of objective in mind. Now, when you look at the New Testament, there are lines that will tell you that a virgin got pregnant. There are lines that will tell you a man walked on water. There are lines that will tell you he rose from the dead, right? I don't personally believe any of these things. I don't find that to be possible. I don't think it's amazing that those things are miracles. I don't really respect a God who would create a bunch of rules and then supposedly manifest as flesh and then be able to break all of those rules. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And I feel like I know what a lie smells like when I see one, right? When I do a probability analysis, it's far more probable that men lied about these things than men actually did these things, right? But that's open to interpretation. I think on a very base level, why would there be a King James Bible, right? Why would there be the need for that? What would that accomplish, right? Why would royal resources go towards that, right? So, this book, I don't personally believe. I think that there's a lot of versions of it where, for example, there's a movie with Denzel Washington, I believe, in it. It's called The Book of Eli. If you rearrange the letters of ELI, they become LIE, right? It's not too hard to find the lie in all of it. I don't think these things are coincidences. If you do, more power to you. You know, there's a lot of codes in certain things. The last thing I'll add is if there's something like, for example, the Zohar, which exists, which is a mystical interpretation, as far as I know, I'm not an expert, of something like sections of the Old Testament, right? There's a different interpretation, kind of like an answer key of Genesis and these different things. Maybe these are analyses, maybe these are theories, right? But part of the issue that I have is if you look at something like the Emerald Tablet, for example, there aren't 1,000 versions of it. There aren't 5 versions of it. There's one version of it and then multiple translations, right? This to me feels and seems much more divine than 66 books that are thrown together at the whim and will of a British king. I'll be honest with you. Excuse me. You may believe whatever you want, but there are multiple books out there you can read. There's a book called The Greatest Lie Ever Sold. That's not a bad one on the topic. You know, I'll be honest with you, at one point in my life, I was a very loyal Christian student. And then I studied a little too much and saw a little too much and couldn't really believe it anymore. I don't think it's a coincidence that somebody who's known to be quite anti-Christian, Friedrich Nietzsche, he has a book literally called The Antichrist. Do you know what he went to college for? What he went to study at a high level? Christianity and the Bible. Right. Right. So, do your own research, find out whatever you want. But on a simple, very basic level, you'll never convince me that a 90-year-old woman got pregnant. You'll never convince me that a virgin got pregnant. You'll never convince me that a man walked on water or died and came back from the dead, right? If you choose to believe these things, that's up to you. But based on the amount that it has sold and how much I know human beings love fantasy, love it, based on who paid for it, right? And also based on what I have seen with my own eyes, this book has been used to do. I cannot trust it, and I cannot believe it. I have to study it and read it like something that is fiction, but that a lot of people believe, right? I don't personally have a copy anymore. I used to read it an awful lot, cover to cover, multiple times. I believe I burned my own copy, but whenever I need to, I can look up online different sections of it. It's available for many people to read. It's not a bad idea to read through it if you never have. You know, you might get sucked into it, fair warning, but I don't personally believe it or find it to be true or really want to believe it anymore. Unfortunately, maybe there's the baby getting thrown out with the bathwater. I don't think it's a bad idea or sentiment to treat your neighbor the way you want to be treated, theoretically. I don't think it's a bad idea to try to be kind or try to do the right thing. I don't think that's a bad idea. I do think it's a bad idea to tell a child that you might choose to marry somebody and she might be impregnated by a spirit one night, right? I do think it's a bad idea to tell somebody that she may choose to marry a male or choose a husband and she'll have to bear a different baby that didn't come from him, right? I don't personally see that as a very positive or helpful thing. And also, I'm not really a believer in something like circumcision. I find that to be genital mutilation. And I think that there's a very clever, tricky tee-up to get parents to participate in this and do this. But I do not think it's a helpful practice. I think that it creates scarring in the mind at a very early age. I think that it feels like betrayal from your parents if you notice that they're allowing something like this to happen. I think it's fear programming, where if it's done by a priest or a doctor, you're supposed to feel that you can't stop these things and that they have a lot of power over you, right? I think that a marking system to mark who is and isn't a part of something is a little questionable, right? People might feel like it's an aristocratic thing where they're higher than people who don't have it, but if you study something like genital mutilation or body markings, especially deep into the past in certain civilizations, it was used more to denote slaves or criminals than it was to denote royalty or loyalty, right? Now, that's not true for everybody. That's not true for every tribe. That's not true for every practice. But it also seems a bit hypocritical if you worship a god to then go and edit this god's design, right? If men weren't supposed to have foreskin, why wouldn't God have made them without them, right? So it seems a little weird to call yourself the people of God and then to go and adjust the creator's design or create multiple creators. I don't know how many creators there are, but I know most of my favorite projects and pieces of art are a collaborative process. I know that I was made by a man and a woman and multiple pairs of grandparents by proxy. So I have a hard time believing there's only one creator, because if we look at cell replication, for example, you have mitosis and you have meiosis. And if there's only one creator, it seems like that would just be cloning, self-cloning. But I wasn't there, right? But if I dig into it a little bit, especially because of how much I studied it, how much I read it, and how much power I felt it have, I don't really believe it. And the last thing I'll add is, I don't know how familiar you are with Michael Jackson and his work. I'm sure you've heard some of his more popular songs. I don't know if you believe in the attempt to character assassinate him before he was, I believe, physically assassinated. I don't personally believe that he harmed children. Some of the evidence that I have for this is his own child does not seem to me like somebody who was hurt by their parent. And I have studied children who have been hurt by their own parents in those ways. And Michael Jackson's son does not show any signs of that. Also, there was a very strong incentive to smear his character and then kill him because of the war that he was going under with a company like Sony, right? But his final album, I believe, was called Escape, which is a play off of the word escape. Now, I might have never figured this out if I didn't start to write my own music and write my own lyrics and create my own artwork. But I realized that sometimes a coded message will be put into artwork. Now, it's not a particularly difficult to decipher code. If you're looking for it, there are some codes out there that are very difficult to decipher. But on the final cover of his final album, called Escape, if you tilt the X, it makes a cross. I don't think that's a coincidence. He also has a line in the song that says something to the effect of, everything is run by the book, right? By the book. I'm sure you've heard that expression before. By the rule book, I believe, is the unspoken piece of that. If you're doing something by the book, you're doing something by the handbook, by the rule book. I believe he was referencing the Bible, right? The King James Bible and how much power it has right now. I also noticed that somewhere like America, where there's supposed to be separation of church and state, the two don't seem too separated to me. I myself have been censored for writing what could be considered satanic, anti-Christian work. I'm not allowed to ever publish a book on Amazon ever again. Now you might ask yourself, what? How could a private company represent a country? How could a private company represent what a company like Amazon does is it reflects the interests of the buyers and also the powers that be. So, certain satanic works are allowed on Amazon for whatever reason, but mine are not. Take it for what you will. I've been banned for life. I've been censored for life. And it was just for trying to publish what the lyrics of my newest song is. The song is titled The Cremation of the Corpse of Christ, which is a reworking of the ritual called the Cremation of Care, which is performed at Bohemian Grove. You can look that up if you wish. Why I was censored, I'm not sure, but I have a funny feeling what I created is actually true and actually powerful, right? But I'd also like to add that I have studied demons, I've studied vampires, I've studied werewolves, I've studied these things beyond just the lens of fiction. All of these fictional tales were inspired by something real in nature. So, if I was born with the spirit of a God in me, why would I have to let that in to me? That should already be in me, right? A demonic possession you have to allow into you. And if somebody was truly a human, when they died, they would die. So if we're talking about a man who died, came back to life, and now a bunch of people are ritualistically drinking his blood during something like communion and eating something like his flesh at something like communion, you have to ask yourself, what type of magic is that really? What type of ritual is that really? So there are a couple ways to look at things. The same way that Michael Jackson can sneak a message into his album, I don't think it would be too hard to sneak something into a gigantic Bible that is very confusing and difficult to master and memorize and really understand at the highest level. That's my own personal opinion, but I have no trust or love for the King James Bible, and that is why. So that covers that. Prometheus out.